Okay. Beyond the Deepwoods by Paul Stewart and Chris Riddell. It's the first book in the Edge Chronicles, and it is written, published by Random House. So chapter 1 is called The Snatchwood Cabin. Twig sat on the floor between his mother's knees and curled his toes in the thick fleece of the tiddler rug. It was cold and draughty, that means drafty, I think, in the cabin. Twig leaned forward and opened the door of the stove. "I want to tell you the story of how you got your name," his mother said. "But I know that story, mother mine," Twig protested. Spelda sighed. Twig felt her warm breath on the back of his neck and smelled the pickled tripweed she had eaten for lunch. He wrinkled his nose. Like so much of the food which the wood trolls relished, Twig found tripweed disgusting, particularly pickled. It was slimy and smelled of rotten eggs. "This time it will be a little different," he heard his mother saying. "This time I will finish the tale." Twig frowned. "I thought I already heard the ending." Spelda tousled her son's thick black hair. "He's grown so fast," she thought, and wiped a tear from the end of her rubbery button nose. "A tale can have many endings," she said sadly, and watched the purple light from the fire gleaming on Twig's high cheekbones and sharp chin. "From the moment you were born," she began, as she always had began, "you were different." Twig nodded. It had been painful, so painful being different when he was growing up, yet it amused him now to think of his parents' surprise when he had appeared, dark, green-eyed, smooth-skinned, and already with unusually long legs for a wood troll. He stared into the fire. The luff wood was burning very well. Purple flames blazed all around the stubby logs as they bumped and tumbled around inside the stove. The wood trolls had many types of wood to choose from, and each had his own special properties. Scent wood, for instance, burned with a fragrance that sent those who breathed it drifting into a dream-filled sleep, while wood from the silvery turquoise lullaby tree sang as the flames lapped at its bark strange mournful songs. They were, and not at all to everyone's taste. And then there was the blood oak, complete with its parasitic sidekick, the barbed creeper known as Terry Vine. Obtaining blood oak wood was hazardous. Any wood troll who did not know its wood lore was liable to end up satisfying the tree's love of flesh, for the blood oak and the Terry Vine were two of the greatest dangers in the dark and perilous deep woods. Certainly the wood of the blood oak gave off a lot of heat, and it neither smelled nor sang, but the way it wailed and screamed as it burned put off all but a few. No, among the wood trolls, luff wood was by far the most popular. It burned well, and they found its purple glow restful. Twig yawned as Spelda continued her story. Her voice was high-pitched but guttural. It seemed to gurgle in the back of her throat. "At 4 months, you were already walking upright," she was saying, and Twig heard the pride in his mother's words. Most wood troll children remained down on their knuckles until they were at least 18 months old. Okay, I'm going to show you a picture, because this has cute pictures. So there's the mom, and there's Twig. Do they look like they're from the same family? Okay. 18 months. Okay. But Twig whispered softly, drawn back inside the story, despite himself. He was already anticipating the next part. It was time for the but. Every time it arrived, Twig would shudder and hold his breath. "But," she said, "although you were so ahead of the others physically, you would not speak. 3 years old you were, and not a single word." She shifted around in her chair. "And I don't have to tell you how serious that can be." Once again his mother sighed. Once again Twig screwed up his face in disgust. Something Tag Hair had once said came back to him. "Your nose knows where you belong, Twig." Twig had taken it to mean that he would always recognize the unique smell of his own home. But what if he was wrong? What if the wise old oak elf had been saying in his usual roundabout way that because his nose didn't like what it smelled, this was not his home. Twig swallowed guiltily. This was something he had wished so often as he'd lain in his bunk after yet another day of being teased and taunted and bullied. Through the window, the sun was sinking lower in the dappled sky. The zigzag silhouettes of the deepwood pines were glinting like frozen bolts of lightning. Twig knew there would be snow before his father returned that night. He thought of Tum-Tum out there in the deep woods far beyond the anchor tree. Perhaps at that very moment he was sinking his axe into the trunk of a blood oak. Twig shuddered. His father's felling tales had filled him with deep horror on many a howling night. Although he was a master carver, Tum-Tum Snatchwood earned most of his money from the illicit repair of the sky pirates' ships. This meant using buoyant wood, and the most buoyant wood of all was blood oak. Twig was uncertain of his father's feelings toward him whenever Twig returned to the cabin with a bloodied nose or blackened eyes or clothes covered in slung mud. He wanted his father to wrap him up in his arms and soothe the pain away. Instead, Tum-Tum would give him advice and make demands. Here's a picture. There's his dad, and there he is. Bloody their noses, he said once, black their eyes, and throw not mud, but dung. Show them what you're made of. Later, when his mother was smoothing Heilberry salve into his bruises, she would explain that Tum-Tum was only concerned to prepare him for the harshness of the world outside. But Twig was unconvinced. It was not certain he had seen in it was not concern he'd seen in Tum-Tum's eyes, but contempt. Twig absent-mindedly wound a strand of his long hair around and round his finger as Spelda went on with her story. Names, she was saying. Where would we wood trolls be without them? They tame the wild things of the deep wood and give us our own identity. Ne'er sip of a nameless soup, as the saying goes. Oh, Twig, how I fretted when, at 3 years old, you were still without a name. Twig shivered. He knew that any wood troll who died without a name would be doomed to an eternity in open sky. The trouble was that until an infant had uttered his first word, the naming ritual could not take place. Was it really so silent? Was I really so silent, mother of mine? Said Twig. Spelda looked away. Not a single word passed your lips. I thought perhaps you were like your great-grandfather Weasel. He never spoke either, she sighed. So, on your 3rd birthday, I decided to perform the ritual anyway. Did great-grandfather Weasel look like me? Twig interrupted. No, Twig, said Spelda. There has never been a Snatchwood nor any other wood troll who ever looked like you. Twig tugged at his twist of hair. Am I ugly? He said. Spelda chuckled as she did so. Her downy cheeks puffed out and her small charcoal eyes disappeared in folds of leathery skin. I don't think so, she said. She leaned forwards and wrapped her long arms around Twig's chest. You'll always be my beautiful boy. She paused. Now, where was I? The naming ritual, Twig reminded her. He had heard the story so often, he was no longer sure what he could remember and what he had been told. As the sun rose, Spelda had taken the well-worn path which led to the anchor tree. There she tethered herself to its bulky trunk and set off into the dark, bulky trunk and set off into the dark woods. This was dangerous, not only because of the unseen perils that lurked in the deep woods, but because there was always a chance that the rope would snag and break. Wood Troll's deepest horror was being lost. So see, she's tying herself to that anchor tree, and then she's going to walk into the woods. Those who stray from the path and lose their way are vulnerable to attacks from the Glomglozer, the wildest of all wild creatures in the deep woods. Every wood troll lived in constant terror of an encounter with the fearsome beast. Spelda herself had often frightened her older children with tales of the forest boogeyman. "If you don't stop being such a naughty wood troll," she would say, "the gloamgozer will get you." Deeper and deeper into the deep woods Spelda went. All around her the forest echoed with howls and shrieks of concealed beasts. She fingered the amulets and lucky charms around her neck and prayed for a swift and safe return. Finally, getting to the end of her tether, Spelda pulled a naming knife from her belt. The knife was important. It had been made specially for her son, as knives were made for all wood troll children. They were essential for the naming ritual, and when the youngsters came of age, each one was given his or her individual naming knife to keep. Spelda gripped the handle tightly, reached forwards, and, as the procedure demanded, hacked off a piece of wood from the nearest tree. It was this little bit of deep wood which would reveal the child's name. Spelda worked quickly. She knew only too well that the sound of chopping would attract inquisitive, possibly deadly attention. When she was done, she tucked the wood under her arm, trotted back through the wood, untied herself from the anchor tree, and returned to the cabin. There she kissed the piece of wood twice and threw it into the fire. "With your brothers and sisters, the names came at once," Spelda explained. "Snodpill, henchweed, poo sniff, as clear as you like. But with you, the wood did nothing but crackle and hiss. The deep woods had refused to name you." "And yet I have a name," said Twig. "Indeed you have," said Spelda, "thanks to Taghair." Twig nodded. He remembered the occasion so well. Taghair had just returned to the village after a long spell away. Twig remembered how overjoyed the wood trolls had all been to have the oak elf back among them. For Taghair, who was well versed in the finer points of wood lore, was their advisor, their counselor, their oracle. It was to him that the wood trolls came with their worries. There was already quite a gathering beneath his ancient lullaby tree when we arrived, Spelda was saying. Taghair was sitting in his empty caterbird cocoon, holding forth about where he had been and what he had seen on his travels. The moment he saw me, however, his eyes opened wide and his ears rotated. "Whatever's up?" he asked. And I told him everything. "Oh, for goodness sake, pull yourself together," he said, when he pointed to you. "Tell me," he said, what is that round the little one's neck?" "That's his comfort cloth," I said. "He won't let anyone touch it, and he won't be parted from it neither. His father tried once, said the boy was too old for such childish things. But he just curled up into a ball and cried till we gave it back to him." Twig knew what was coming next. He had heard it so many times before. Then Taghair said, "Give it to me," and stared into your eyes with those big black eyes of his. All oak elves have eyes like that. They could see those parts of the world that remain hidden to others. "And I gave him my comfort cloth," whispered Twig. Even now he didn't like anyone touching it and kept it tightly knotted around his neck. "That you did," continued Spelda, "and I can scarce believe it to this day. But that wasn't all. Oh no." "Oh no," echoed Twig. "He took your cloth and he sort of stroked it, all gentle-like, as if it was a living thing, and then he traced the pattern on it with his fingertip ever so lightly. A lullaby tree, he said at last, and I saw that he was right. I'd always thought it was just a pretty pattern, all those squiggles and little stitches, but no, it was a lullaby tree, all right, plain as the nose on your face." Twig laughed. "And the strange thing was, you didn't mind old Taghair touching your cloth. You just sat there all serious and silent. Then he gave you that stare of his again and said in a soft voice, "You're part of the Deepwoods, Silent One. The naming ritual has not worked, but you are part of the Deepwoods. A part of the Deepwoods," he repeated, his eyes glazing over. Then he raised his head, spread his arms wide. "His name shall be Twig," Twig exclaimed, unable to keep silent a moment longer. So there's a picture of the elf and Twig. "That's right," said Spelda, laughing. "Out you came with it. Just like that. Twig! The first word you ever spoke." And then Taghair said, "You must look after him well, for this boy is special." Not different, but special. It was one fact that had kept him going when the other Wood Troll children had picked on him so mercilessly. Not a single day had passed without some incident or other. But the worst time of all was when he'd been set upon during the fateful Trock Bladder match. Before then, Twig had loved the game. Not that he was very good at it, but he had always enjoyed the excitement of the chase, for Trock Bladder was a game that involved a great deal of running about. It was played on a large square of land between the back of the village and the forest. The pitch was crisscrossed with well-worn paths beaten out by generations of young wood trolls. Between these bare patches of grass grew thick and tall. The rules of the game were simple. There were 2 teams with as many wood trolls on each side as wanted to play. The aim was to catch the Trock Bladder, the bladder of a hamel horn stuffed with dried trock beans, and run 12 paces, calling out the numbers as you went. If you managed that, you were allotted a shot at the central basket, which could double your score. However, since the ground was often slippery, the Trock Bladder always squiggly, and the entire opposing team was trying to wrest the ball away, this was not as easy as it sounded. In his 8 years of playing the game, Twig had never once managed to score the Trock Bladder. On this particular morning, no one was having much luck. Heavy rain had left the pitch waterlogged, and the game kept stopping and starting as time after time, wood troll after wood troll came sliding off the muddy paths. It wasn't until the 3rd quarter that the Trock Bladder landed near enough to Twig for him to seize it and start running. 1, 2, 3, he yelled out, as with the Trock Bladder wedged beneath the elbow of his left arm, he belted along the paths, which led to the center of the pitch. The nearer to the basket you were when you reached 12, the easier it was to score. 4, 5. In front of him, half a dozen members of the opposing team were converging on him. He darted down the path to the left. His opponents dashed after him. 6, 7. "To me, Twig, to me!" Various members of his own team yelled out. "Pass it!" But Twig didn't pass it. He wanted to score. He wanted to hear his teammates cheer, to feel their hands slap him on the back. For once he wanted to be the hero. 8, 9. He was completely surrounded. "Pass it to me," he heard. It was Hodgegruff calling from the far side of the pitch. Twig knew that if he chucked the ball to him now, his friend would have a good chance of scoring for the team. But that was no good. You remembered who scored, not who set up the goal. Twig wanted everyone to remember he had scored. He paused. Half of the opposing team were almost upon him. He couldn't go forwards. He couldn't go back. He looked around the basket, so near and yet so far. He wanted that goal. He wanted it more than anything. All at once, a little voice in his head seemed to say, "But what's the problem? The rules say nothing about sticking to the path." Twig looked back toward the basket and swallowed nervously. The next instant, he did what no wood troll before had ever done. He left the path. The long grass whipped at his bare legs as he loped toward the basket. 10, 11, 12, he screamed, and dunked the bladder down through the basket. "A Trock Bladder," he cried, and looked around happily. "A 24-pointer! I've scored a He stopped. The wood trolls on both teams were glaring at him. There were no cheers, no slaps on the back. "You step from the path," one of them shouted. "No one steps from the path," cried another. But, Twig stammered. "There's nothing in the rules that says—" But the other wood trolls were not listening. They knew, of course, that the rules didn't mention keeping to the paths, but then why should they? In Truckbladder, as in their lives, the wood trolls never ever strayed from the paths. It was a given. It was taken as read. It would have made as much sense to have a rule telling them not to stop breathing. All at once, as if by some prearranged signal, the wood trolls fell on Twig. "You lanky weirdo!" they cried, as they kicked him and punched him. "You hideous, gangly freak!" A sudden fiery pain tore through Twig's arm. It felt as if it had been branded. He looked up to see a wodge of his smooth flesh being viciously twisted by a handful of hard spatula fingers. Oh, look at. They're twisting his arm. Oh my gosh. "Hotter gruff," Twig whispered. The Snatchwoods and the Gropeknots were neighbors. He and Hodgegruff had been born within a week of each other and grew up together. Twig had thought they were friends. Hottergruff sneered and twisted the skin around still further. Twig bit into his lower lip and fought back tears, not because of the pain in his arm, that he could bear, but because Hottergruff had now also turned against him. As Twig had stumbled home, battered, bruised, and bleeding, it was the fact that he'd lost his only friend that hurt the most. Now, because he was different, he was also alone. Okay, there's a little bit more. "Special," said Twig and snorted. "Yes," Spelda said. "Even the Sky Pirates recognized that fact when they saw you," she added softly. "That is why your father," her voice faltered, that is why you must leave home." Twig froze. "Leave home? What did she mean?" He spun around and stared at his mother. She was weeping. "I don't understand," he said. "Do you want me to go?" "Of course I don't, Twig," she sobbed. "But you'll be 13 in less than a week, an adult." "What will you do then? You cannot fell wood like your father. You're not built for it. And where will you live? The cabin is already too small for you. And now that the Sky Pirates know about you—" Twig twisted a knot of hair around and around his finger. 3 weeks earlier, he had gone with his father far into the Deepwoods, where wood trolls felled and fashioned the wood that they sold to the Sky Pirates. Whereas his father could walk upright beneath the lowest branches, Twig had to stoop. And even that wasn't enough. Time and again, he knocked his head until his scalp had become a mass of angry red grazes. In the end, Twig had had no option but to crawl on his hands and knees to the clearing. Our latest felling recruit, Tum had said to the Sky Pirate in charge of delivering that morning. The pirate glanced over his clipboard and looked Twig up and down. "Looks too tall," he said, and went back to his paperwork. Twig stared at the Sky Pirate. Tall and upright, he looked magnificent with his tricorn hat and tooled leather breastplate, his pair of wings and waxed side whiskers. His coat was patched in places, but was, with its ruffles and tassels, golden buttons and braid, none the less splendid for that. Each of the numerous objects that hung from special hooks seemed to shout an adventure of adventure. So that's what he looks like. That's the pirate. Twig found himself wondering who the Sky Pirate had fought with that cutlass, with its ornately jeweled hilt, and what had caused the nick in its long curved blade. He wondered what marvels the Sky Pirate had seen through his telescope, what walls he had scaled with the grappling irons, what distant places his compass led him to. Suddenly the Sky Pirate looked up again. He caught Twig staring at him and raised a quizzical brow. Twig stared at his feet. "Tell you what," the Sky Pirate said to Tum, There's always a place for a tall young man on a sky ship. No, said Tum-Tum sharply. Thank you very much for the offer, he added politely, but no. Tum-Tum knew his son wouldn't last 10 minutes on board ship. The sky pirates were shiftless, shameless rogues. They would slit your throats as soon as look at you. It was only because they paid so well for the buoyant Deepwood timber that the wood trolls had anything to do with them at all. The sky pirate shrugged. Just a thought, he said, and turned away. Pity, though, he muttered. As Twig crawled back through the deep woods behind his father, he thought of the ships he had watched flying overhead. Sails full, soaring off, up and away, sky-riding, he whispered, and his heart quickened. Surely, he thought, there are worse things to do. Back in the wood troll cabin, Spelda thought otherwise. Oh, those sky pirates, she grumbled. Tum-Tum should never have taken you to meet them in the first place. Now they'll be back for you, as sure as my name's Spelda Snatchwood. But the sky pirate I saw didn't seem bothered whether I joined the crew or not, said Twig. That's what they pretend, said Spelda. But look what happened to Hobblebark and Hogwart. Seized from their beds they were, and never seen again. Oh, Twig, I couldn't bear it if that happened to you. It would break my heart. Outside, the wind howled through the dense deep woods. As darkness fell, the air filled with the sounds of the wakening night creatures. Fromps coughed and spat, Quarm squiggled, while the great Banderbear beat its monstrous hairy chest and yodeled to its mate. Far away in the distance, Twig could just about make out the familiar rhythmic pounding of the slaughterers, still hard at work. What am I to do then? Twig asked softly. Spelda sniffed. In the short term, you're to go and stay with cousin Snetterbark, she said. We've already sent message and he's expecting you. Just until things blow over, she added. Sky willing, you'll be safe there. And after, said Twig, I can come home again then, can I? Yes, Spelda said slowly. Twig knew at once that there was more to come. But, he said, Spelda trembled and hugged the boy's head to her chest. Oh, Twig, my beautiful boy, she sobbed. There's something else I must tell you. Twig pulled away and looked up at her troubled face. There were tears rolling down his own cheeks now. What is it, mother mine? He asked nervously. Oh, glozers, Spelda cursed. This isn't easy. She looked at the boy tearfully. Although I have loved you as my own since the day you arrived, you are not my son, Twig, nor is Tum-Tum your father. Twig stared in silent disbelief. Then who am I? He said. Spelda shrugged. We found you, she said, a little bundle all wrapped up in a shawl at the foot of our tree. Found me? Twig whispered. Spelda nodded, leaned forwards and touched the cloth knotted around Twig's neck. Twig flinched. My comfort cloth? He said. That shawl? Spelda sighed. The very same, she said. The shawl we found you wrapped in. The shawl you won't be parted from even now. Twig stroked the fabric with trembling fingers. He heard Spelda sniff. Oh, Twig, she said, although we are not your parents, Tum-Tum and I have loved you like our very own. Tum-Tum asked me to say goodbye for him. He said, she stopped, overwhelmed with sadness. He said to tell you that whatever happens, you must never forget he loves you. Now that the words were said, Spelda abandoned herself to her grief completely. She wailed with misery, and uncontrolled sobbing racked her entire body. Twig knelt across and wrapped his arms right around his mother's neck. So I am to leave at once, he said. It's for the best, Spelda said, but you will return, Twig, won't you? She added uncertainly. Believe me, my beautiful boy, I didn't ever want to have to tell you the end of the tale, but... Don't cry, said Twig. This isn't the end of the tale. Spelda looked up and sniffed. You're right, she said, and smiled bravely. It's more of a beginning, isn't it? Yes, that's it. That's what it is, Twig. A new start. Dun, dun, dun. So there he is. And the next chapter is called The Hoverworm.